At Elva, Vertiutvoa, on March 18, 1945, Captain James Slick Eubanks sat alone in the cockpit of his P-51D Mustang, 28,000 feet above the burning capital of the Third Reich. The air temperature outside was 58 degrees below zero. Inside the unpressurized cockpit, the only thing keeping his blood from freezing was the heat radiating from the Packard V1650 Merlin engine, roaring just 3 feet in front of his knees. Eubanks was 24 years old, but his eyes looked 50. He had flown 62 combat missions over Europe. Most pilots who survived that long did it by following the rules. They flew formation. They checked their six. They respected the red line, the maximum speed limit of the aircraft. The North American Aviation Flight Manual for the P-51D stated clearly in bold red letters, "Do not exceed 505 miles per hour in a dive. Risk of structural failure is catastrophic." Eubanks knew that page. He had memorized it, and then he had decided to ignore it. He wasn't a university-trained officer like the others. He had grown up in the Dust Bowls of Oklahoma, fixing tractors before he could walk, and racing souped-up Fords on dirt tracks before he could read. He understood machines not by reading manuals, but by listening to them scream. The mission briefing that morning at Leiston Airfield had been grim. Intelligence reported that the Luftwaffe was deploying a new weapon over Berlin. They called it the Schwalbe the Swallow, the Messerschmitt Me 262. It didn't have propellers. It had jet engines. It could fly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest American fighter. The intelligence officer had been blunt. If you see a jet, do not try to dive after it. You cannot catch it. If you try to dive at that speed, your controls will lock up due to compressibility. You will become a lawn dart. Eubanks scanned the horizon. Below him, the B-17 Flying Fortresses looked like tiny silver toys floating on a carpet of flak. Black puffs of smoke marked the sky where German 88mm anti-aircraft shells were exploding. But Eubanks wasn't watching the flak. He was watching the sun. He checked his gauges. Manifold pressure, 40 inches. RPM, 2,300. Fuel, main tanks full. Drop tanks empty. He reached down and toggled the release lever. The 275-gallon aluminum fuel tanks dropped from his wings, tumbling silently toward Germany. He was light now. He was clean. Bogies, 12 o'clock high. Angels 35. The radio crackled. Eubanks looked up. 5,000 feet above him, leaving white contrails against the deep blue stratosphere, were 4 shapes. They didn't look like planes. They looked like sharks with their fins cut off. No propellers. Just swept wings and engines that whined like banshees. The Me 262 seconds. They were positioning for a diving attack on the bombers. The standard tactic was to turn into them, try to disrupt their aim. But you couldn't hit what you couldn't catch. The German jets were preparing to slash through the bomber formation at 540 miles per hour, fire their 30mm cannons, and zoom climb back to safety before any American escort could touch them. Eubanks didn't turn. He didn't climb. Instead, he did the one thing the manual, his commanding officer, and the laws of physics said was suicide. He pushed the stick forward. Not a little. All the way. He wasn't diving away from the fight. He was diving above the fight, anticipating where the jets would be in 30 seconds. He was trading altitude for speed, a speed that the P-51 was never designed to handle. He was gambling his life on a stupid theory he had developed while tinkering with engines in Oklahoma, that the red line wasn't a wall, but a door, and he was about to kick it open. The Merlin engine howled as the Mustang's nose dropped past 40 degrees. Gravity slammed Eubanks against his seatbelts. The airspeed indicator began to climb. 300, 350, 400. The dive had begun. The needle passed 450, then 480, then 500. The red line. Eubanks didn't blink. He kept his hand heavy on the throttle, pushing the war emergency power. The engine was screaming at 70 inches of manifold pressure. The airframe began to shudder. It wasn't a rattle. It was a violent, bone-shaking convulsion. The North American aviation engineers called this compressibility. Eubanks called it riding a jackhammer. At 520 miles per hour, The air flowing over the Mustang's wings reached the speed of sound. Shock waves formed on the upper surfaces. They moved back along the wing, disrupting the airflow over the control surfaces. The stick, which had been light and responsive a moment ago, turned into stone. Eubanks pulled back, trying to shallow the dive just a fraction to line up his shot. The stick didn't move. It felt like it was set in concrete. This was the death zone. This was where rookies died. When compressibility hit, the center of lift shifted aft. The aircraft tucked under. The nose dropped heavier. The dive got steeper. The speed increased until the wings ripped off, or the plane buried itself in the German soil. The manual said, "Reduce throttle immediately. Do not fight the controls." But reducing throttle meant losing the jets. Eubanks did the opposite. He kept the power full. He was falling at 550 miles per hour now. The canopy started to frost over from the friction heat battling the sub-zero air. The aluminum skin on the wings rippled like water. He was falling faster than any piston engine plane was ever meant to fly. But he wasn't just falling, he was hunting. He looked through the K-14 gyro gun sight. The 4 German jets were 2,000 feet below him, leveling out for their attack run on the bombers. They were fast, moving at 540 miles per hour. But Eubanks was coming down from the heavens at nearly 600. He was a meteor. The German flight leader checked his mirrors. He saw a dot, then a shape, then a monster, growing larger by the millisecond. He must have thought his eyes were lying. A propeller plane catching a jet? Impossible. Physics said no. Eubanks said yes. But the American pilot had a problem. He was closing the distance, but he couldn't aim. The stick was frozen solid by the shock waves. If he couldn't pull the nose up to lead the target, he would overshoot or slam directly into the enemy fuselage. This was the moment of truth. This was the suicidal maneuver. In Oklahoma, on the dirt tracks, when the steering locked up, you didn't panic. You improvised. Here, in the transonic zone, Eubanks knew he couldn't use the stick. So he reached for the trim wheel. The trim tabs were small metal flaps on the trailing edge of the elevators, designed to help stabilize the plane during cruising. They were delicate instruments. They weren't meant to steer a 5-ton fighter pulling 6 Gs at terminal velocity. Eubanks moved his hand to the trim wheel by his left knee. It was the size of a saucer. If he turned it too much, the sudden aerodynamic force would snap the tail section off instantly. If he turned it too little, he would miss the intercept. He needed the touch of a surgeon in the middle of an earthquake. He spun the wheel back. Quarter turn. Half turn. The air bit into the small tab. The tail groaned under the stress. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose began to lift. The invisible grip of the shock waves fought him, but the trim tab fought back. The Mustang shuddered violently, protesting the abuse. Eubanks gritted his teeth, his vision graying out at the edges as the G-forces built up. He was surfing a shock wave, balancing on the razor's edge of structural disintegration. He was steering a runaway train with a mechanism the size of a playing card, and right in the center of his glowing reticle, the lead Me 262 was filling the glass. The range closed to 400 yards. 300, 200. At this closing speed, a collision was less than a heartbeat away. Eubanks didn't have time to think. He let his instincts, honed on the dirt tracks of Oklahoma, take over. He wasn't flying a plane anymore. He was aiming a projectile. The K-14 gyro gun sight was dancing, trying to calculate the impossible lead for a target moving near the speed of sound. Eubanks ignored the floating reticle. He looked past the glass, trusting his eyes. He squeezed the trigger. The 6M, 2 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns in the wings roared to life. This wasn't a precision tap, it was a hammer blow. The guns fired at a combined rate of 75 rounds per second. The recoil was so violent that the Mustang, already shaking from the shock waves, felt like it was being torn apart by a giant hand. The cockpit filled with the smell of cordite and the deafening rhythmic thudding that drowned out even the scream of the engine. Eubanks watched the streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds lash out. He didn't need to lead much. He was coming down right on top of the German spine. The bullets struck home. They didn't just hit the fuselage. They were ingested by the twin Jumo 004 jet engines. The sensitive turbines, spinning at thousands of RPM, couldn't handle the foreign metal. The result was catastrophic. The starboard engine of the Me-262 didn't just fail, it detonated. The compressor blades shattered, sending shrapnel slicing through the fuel lines. A nanosecond later, the jet fuel ignited. Eubanks didn't see a plane anymore. He saw a blossoming flower of orange fire and black smoke, expanding directly in his flight path. He was traveling at nearly 600 miles per hour. There was no time to turn, no time to bank. He had committed to the suicidal line, and now he had to pay the toll. He clenched his jaw, braced his neck against the headrest, and flew straight into the fireball. For a split second, the world went dark. Oil and soot coated his canopy. Debris hammered against the leading edge of his wings like hail. He heard a sickening thump as a piece of the German tail section glanced off his propeller spinner. And then he punched through the other side. He was out of the fire, back into the freezing blue air. But he wasn't safe. He was alive, but he was still diving, screaming earthward at terminal velocity. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. 12,000 feet, 10,000, 8,000. The ground, which had been a patchwork quilt of greens and browns, was now rushing up to meet him with terrifying clarity. He could see individual houses. He could see trees, and they were getting bigger fast. Now came the second part of the suicide maneuver. He had broken the red line to catch the jet. Now he had to break the laws of physics to stop. If he pulled back on the stick too hard, the wings would snap off instantly, folding upwards like paper. If he didn't pull back hard enough, he would auger into the German countryside and leave a crater 10 feet deep. He eased back on the stick. It was still heavy, still fighting him, but as the air grew denser at lower altitudes, the controls began to bite. The G-forces hit him like a physical blow. 4 Gs. 5 Gs. 6. The blood rushed from his head, pooling in his legs. His vision narrowed. The world turned into a tunnel. The gray edges of consciousness crept in. He started the grunt maneuver, tensing his stomach muscles, forcing air into his lungs, fighting to keep the blood in his brain. 7 Gs. The airframe groaned, a metallic scream of torture. Rivets popped on the wing surfaces. The aluminum skin stressed to its yield point, but the nose was coming up. The horizon, which had been vertical, started to tilt back towards horizontal. He was leveling out, but he was skimming the treetops. He flashed over a German flak battery so low he could see the terrified faces of the gunners looking up, too shocked to even fire. He had survived the dive. He had killed the Swallow. But as he cleared his vision and checked his 6, he realized the celebration was premature. He was alone, low on deck, deep in enemy territory, and he had just kicked a hornet's nest. The sky above was death, but the ground below was a grave waiting to be filled. Eubanks was flying at 400 miles per hour, 50 feet off the deck. At 28,000 feet, 400 feels like floating. At 50 feet, it feels like the end of the world. The landscape of Germany wasn't passing by. It was exploding past his peripheral vision in a blur of gray and green. He was trapped in the devil's basement. He couldn't climb. Climbing meant bleeding off his speed and presenting a perfect silhouette against the sky for every anti-aircraft gunner in Berlin. His only survival option was to stay low, so low that the German radar couldn't track him and the gunners couldn't depress their barrels fast enough to lead him. He was literally flying under the radar, cutting the grass with his propeller. But Berlin wasn't a cornfield in Oklahoma. It was an industrial fortress. Factories, smokestacks, and church spires rushed at him like stone spears. Eubanks wasn't flying by instruments anymore. He was flying by raw reflex. He banked hard left to miss a chimney, pulled up sharply to clear high-tension power lines, and then slammed the stick forward to hug the terrain again. His landing gear tires were inches from skimming the rooftops. Then, the ground fire started. It wasn't the heavy 88mm flak clouds from before. This was worse. It was small arms fire. Every soldier with a rifle, every rooftop machine gun placement, every 20mm quad cannon mount opened up on the lone Mustang, screaming over their heads. Tracers zipped past his canopy like angry fireflies. They looked slow at first, floating lazy arcs, and then whipped past at the speed of light. Thump, thump. He felt the impacts. Bullets were punching holes in his fuselage. He didn't look back to check the damage. Looking back meant flying into a tree. He kept his eyes locked forward, scanning for obstacles, his hands dancing on the stick and rudder pedals. He was a rat running through a maze of fire. Slick! Brake right! Brake right! The warning came over the radio, faint and static-filled. It was his wingman, somewhere thousands of feet above. Eubanks checked his mirror. Two shapes were diving out of the sun behind him. They weren't jets this time. They were Focke-Wulf 192nds, the butcherbirds. The FAV 190 was dangerous at high altitude, but down here on the deck, it was lethal. It had a roll rate faster than the Mustang, and 4 cannons that could tear a fighter in half with a 1-second burst. They had seen the lone American separated from the herd, wounded and low. They smelled blood. The lead German pilot was good. He cut the corner, anticipating Eubanks' path. Tracers from the Focke-Wulf flashed over Eubanks' right wing. The German was walking his fire inward, trying to saw the Mustang's cockpit in half. Eubanks had no altitude to trade for energy. He had no room to dive. He was cornered. Most pilots would have panicked. They would have pulled back on the stick, tried to climb, and died. Eubanks did the opposite. He did something that defied sanity. He shoved the throttle through the gate, engaging the war emergency power again, risking blowing his overheated engine, and he dropped his flaps. Dropping flaps at 400 miles per hour is like slamming on the parking brake on the highway. The Mustang groaned in protest. The sudden drag slowed the plane violently. It was a maneuver strictly forbidden in the manual. But it worked. The German pilot, coming in hot and fast behind him, didn't expect the American to stop in midair. The Focke-Wulf overshot. The gray German fighter roared past Eubanks, passing just feet above his canopy. For a split second, Eubanks could see the rivets on the enemy plane's belly. The hunter had just flown past his prey. Eubanks retracted the flaps, slammed the throttle forward, and kicked the rudder hard. The Mustang skidded in the air, nose coming around. The tables had turned. The hunted was now behind the hunter. The Focke-Wulf was filling his windshield. It was so close Eubanks could see the oil streaks on the German's fuselage. The maneuver had worked perfectly. By dropping his flaps and killing his speed, Eubanks had forced the enemy to fly right past him. Now, the roles were reversed. The predator was the prey, and Eubanks was sitting in the blind spot, 60 yards behind the German's tail. He didn't need the K-14 gun sight. At this range, you don't aim. You simply point. Eubanks clamped his hand down on the stick and squeezed the trigger. All 6. 50 caliber machine guns erupted at once. The vibration rattled his teeth. The noise was a physical weight in the cockpit. The streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds didn't arc. They lashed out like solid bars of light. They slammed into the Focke-Wulf's BMW 801 radial engine. The German plane shuddered under the impact of 75 rounds per second. Pieces of cowling flew off. White smoke, then black oil, then orange fire erupted from the nose. The German pilot tried to pull up, to trade speed for altitude, but it was too late. His controls had been severed. The Fu 190 rolled lazily to the left, its belly exposing itself to the sky, and smashed into a plowed field. There was no explosion, just a disintegrating spray of dirt and metal as the aircraft cartwheeled through a stone fence and vanished in a cloud of dust. There was no parachute. At 50 feet, you don't get to bail out. You ride the machine to the end. Eubanks didn't celebrate. He didn't even watch the crash. His eyes were already locked on the rearview mirror. The second Focke-Wulf was still there, the wingman. He had seen his leader die, and now he was frantic. He was pulling a hard high-G turn, trying to get a firing solution on Eubanks. The P-51 Mustang is a thoroughbred at high altitude. But down here in the thick air, it was a muscle car. It was heavy. It took muscle to throw it around. Eubanks stomped on the left rudder pedal and racked the stick over. The G-forces returned, slamming him into the seat. His G-suit inflated, squeezing his legs to keep the blood in his brain, but his vision was tunneling again. He was fighting the plane as much as the enemy. They entered a scissors maneuver, a series of violent reversing turns, each pilot trying to force the other out in front. It was a knife fight in a phone booth. They were crossing over each other's flight paths, snap-rolling, chopping throttle, and slamming it open again. The Merlin engine was screaming at maximum RPM, the temperature gauge needle buried in the red. Below them, the German countryside was a green blur. Farmers looked up from their fields to see two metal monsters dancing a death spiral just above the treetops. Cows scattered. Chickens were sucked into the slipstreams. It was surreal. Up at 30,000 feet, war is clean and cold. Down here, it was dirty, loud, and personal. Eubanks was sweating profusely. His flight suit was soaked. His arms ached from wrestling the hydraulicless controls. The P-51D didn't have power steering. At 400 miles per hour, moving the ailerons required 50 pounds of force. He had been fighting for 5 minutes, but it felt like 5 hours. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and running on pure adrenaline. Then, the German made a mistake. It was a small one. He pulled too hard on a turn. The high-speed stall snapped his wing down. The Focke-Wulf wobbled, losing energy. That split-second loss of momentum was all Eubanks needed. He reversed his turn, the Mustang responding sluggishly but obediently. He lined up the shot. He had the angle. He pressed the trigger. Click. The gun spun, but no fire came out. He pressed again. Click. The vibration was gone. The roar was gone. He checked the ammo counters on the wings. They read 0. He had burned through all his ammunition on the jet, and the first Focke-Wulf. He was flying the fastest fighter in the world, but right now it was just an unarmed aluminum glider, and the German pilot, recovering from his stall, was swinging his nose around. He still had cannons, and he looked angry. The silence of the guns was louder than the engine. For a pilot, the click of an empty chamber is the sound of death. Eubanks didn't waste a microsecond cursing his luck. He knew the German pilot, recovering from his stall 200 yards behind, would figure it out instantly. When a P-51 stops shooting at a target filling its windshield, it's not out of mercy. It's out of bullets. The Focke-Wulf leveled out. Its nose came around. The German pilot knew he had won. He didn't need to fly fancy anymore. He just needed to line up the shot and finish the job. Eubanks checked his engine gauges. The coolant temperature was pinned at the top of the scale. The Packard Merlin had been running at war emergency power for too long. It was cooking itself alive. If he kept the throttle wide open, the engine would seize in minutes. If he throttled back, the German would chew his tail off in seconds. It was a choice between blowing up or getting shot down. Eubanks chose the engine. He kept the throttle against the firewall. The Mustang surged forward, trailing a thin wisp of white coolant vapor. He was running for his life, hugging the contours of the Spree River, using the terrain as a shield. Behind him, the Focke-Wulf's cannons began to thump. Boom, 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 boom. Tracers whipped past the canopy again. The German was taking his time, firing short, disciplined bursts. He was toying with the American. He knew Eubanks had nowhere to go. They were screaming over the industrial outskirts of Berlin now. Warehouses, train yards, and cranes flashed by. Eubanks flew like a man possessed. He banked vertical to squeeze between two smokestacks. He dipped a wing to clear a crane arm. He was flying so low, the prop wash was kicking up wake on the river surface. But the German wouldn't shake. He was a veteran. He matched every move, cutting the corners, closing the distance. He was sitting in the saddle, just out of the slipstream, waiting for the perfect kill shot. Eubanks looked in the mirror and saw the muzzle flashes. A 20mm shell clipped his rudder. The pedals kicked under his feet. The controls were getting mushy. He was losing hydraulic pressure. He needed a miracle. Or he needed to do something so reckless that even a combat veteran wouldn't follow. Ahead of him, looming out of the industrial smog, was a railway viaduct. It was a massive structure of brick and steel, spanning the river. The arches were narrow, designed for barges, not for fighter planes with a 37-foot wingspan. And to make matters worse, there was a train crossing it. Smoke from the locomotive was drifting down, obscuring the gaps between the stone pillars. Any sane pilot would pull up and hop over the bridge. That's what the manual said. That's what physics demanded. But pulling up meant exposing his belly to the Germans' guns for 2 critical seconds. That was 2 seconds Eubanks didn't have. He made the decision in a heartbeat. He didn't pull up. He pushed the nose down. He was going to thread the needle. He aimed for the center arch, obscured by coal smoke and shadows. The gap was barely 40 feet wide. The Mustang was 37 feet wide. That left 18 inches of clearance on each wingtip, at 400 miles per hour. The German pilot saw the bridge too. He saw the American dive toward the water. He must have thought Eubanks had been hit, that he was crashing. No one flies under a bridge in combat. It's a suicide move. The Focke-Wulf pilot instinctively pulled back on the stick to clear the structure, rising up to hop over the tracks. Eubanks held his breath. The water rushed up. The stone pillars filled his vision. The world turned into a gray blur of brick and smoke. He leveled the wings with the precision of a diamond cutter. If he flinched, if he sneezed, if the turbulence nudged him 1 degree, he would be a smear on the architecture. Whoosh! The sound changed instantly as he shot under the arch. The echo of the engine off the stone walls was deafening. For a fraction of a second, he was in the dark, enveloped by the bridge's shadow. Then he burst out the other side into the sunlight, spray misting his windshield. He checked the mirror. The sky behind him was empty. The German was gone. But then, he looked up. The Focke-Wulf hadn't crashed. It had cleared the bridge and was diving back down, looking for the wreckage of the American fool. Instead, the German saw the silver Mustang speeding away, still alive, still running. The trick had bought Eubanks 3 seconds. But the hunt wasn't over. The euphoria of the bridge stunt evaporated instantly. The adrenaline crash hit Eubanks like a physical blow. His hands were shaking on the stick, not from fear, but from the chemical exhaustion of cheating death 3 times in 20 minutes. The bridge was behind him, but the war wasn't. He was 400 miles from the English Channel. He had no ammunition. He had critical fuel levels, and his engine was dying. The Packard Merlin, usually a symphony of mechanical precision, was now making a sound like a bag of hammers. The coolant temperature gauge was pegged at 120 degrees Celsius. The glycol was boiling off. If the engine seized, the Mustang had the glide ratio of a brick. At 50 feet altitude, a seized engine meant he would be dead in 6 seconds. Eubanks began the most dangerous game of his life, nursing a crippled machine through the heart of the Third Reich. He throttled back, sacrificing speed for engine life. The airspeed dropped to 250. He was slow. He was low. He was the perfect target. He checked his navigation. In the chaos of the dogfight and the chase, he had drifted south. He wasn't flying over empty farmland anymore. He was flying directly over the Luftwaffe's fighter training grounds near Magdeburg. Suddenly, the ground below him changed from green fields to concrete runways. He had stumbled directly over a German airfield, and it was active. Below him, parked in neat rows, were Heinkel bombers and Messerschmitt fighters. Mechanics were working on engines. Fuel trucks were driving across the tarmac. Eubanks held his breath. He was so low he could see the faces of the ground crew turning up to look at him. They froze. They saw the silver star on the wing. They saw the distinct silhouette of the P-51. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The Germans were stunned. An American fighter, alone, flying at rooftop height right down the center line of their runway. It was so audacious, so insane, that they assumed it was a trick. They assumed he was leading a squadron. They assumed he was about to strafe them. The ground crew dived for cover. Mechanics threw down their wrenches and scrambled into bunkers. An anti-aircraft gun crew on a tower spun their weapon around, but they hesitated. They were waiting for the rest of the American attackers to appear. But there were no attackers. There was just Eubanks, sweating in his cockpit, praying that his empty guns didn't give away the bluff. He kept the nose level. He didn't bank. He didn't flinch. He flew straight down the runway, pretending to be the predator when he was actually the ghost. He passed over the airfield in 10 seconds. It felt like 10 years. As he cleared the perimeter fence, the Germans realized their mistake. The squadron wasn't coming. It was one lone, damaged plane. The flak tower opened up behind him. Black puffs of 20mm explosions dotted the air around his tail. Tracers zipped past his wings. Eubanks slammed the throttle forward again, ignoring the screaming temperature gauge. The engine coughed, then roared. He stayed low, dipping into a valley, putting a hill between him and the guns. He had survived the airfield, but he had pushed his luck to the absolute limit. And now, the engine temperature wasn't just high. The needle was bouncing off the stop. A thin film of oil began to spray onto his windshield. The Merlin was bleeding. He was still 300 miles from home, and the machine was starting to die. The cockpit smelled of burning metal and raw gasoline. The oil spraying from the cowling had coated the windscreen entirely, turning the world forward into a smear of opaque black. Eubanks couldn't see. He unlatched the canopy and slid it back, forcing his head out into the freezing slipstream. The wind blast at 250 miles per hour tore at his goggles, and froze the sweat on his face instantly, but it was the only way to fly. He was piloting a dying machine by feel, leaning out the side like a train engineer, watching the horizon tilt and sway. He was bleeding altitude to keep the engine alive, trading potential energy for distance. The Rhine River was the goal. If he could cross the Rhine, he was in Allied territory. If he went down before it, he was a prisoner of war. The vibration changed again. It wasn't a rattle anymore. It was a rhythmic, violent hammering that shook the entire airframe, vibrating the stick so hard it numbed his hands. The crankshaft bearings were gone. The pistons were chewing themselves to pieces inside the cylinders. Eubanks patted the instrument panel, shouting over the noise, begging the machine. "Come on, just 10 more minutes. Don't quit on me now." Ahead, through the haze, he saw it. The Rhine. A gray, winding ribbon, cutting through the battered landscape. But he also saw the black puffs of flak rising from the bridges. The retreating German army was defending the crossings with everything they had left. To cross, he had to climb. Staying low meant getting shredded by small arms fire. Climbing meant stressing the dying engine to its absolute breaking point. He had no choice. He pulled back gently on the stick. The nose rose. The engine groaned, a deep, mechanical death rattle, and the RPM dropped dangerously. He traded his precious airspeed for altitude. 2,000 feet. 3,000. The flak bursts started popping around him, gray clouds of shrapnel appearing in the air, but he was too slow to dodge. He just had to grit his teeth, keep the wings level, and pray the German gunners led him too far. He crossed the west bank of the Rhine at 4,000 feet. He made it. He was over friendly soil. A wave of relief washed over him, but it lasted less than a second. Bang! A sound like a cannon shot came from the nose. The aircraft shuddered violently, lurching forward as the drag of the spinning propeller suddenly vanished. Then, silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. The Packard Merlin had seized. The propeller blade froze solid, standing straight up like a black tombstone in front of the cowling. The roar that had been his companion for 3 hours was replaced by the eerie rushing of the wind over the wings. Mayday, Mayday. This is P-51 Mustang, Angels 4, engine out, dead stick over the Rhine. He keyed the mic, but there was no static. The electrical system had died with the generator. He was deaf, dumb, and falling. A P-51 without an engine is not a glider. It is a 5-ton anvil with wings. It descends at a rate of 3,000 feet per minute. Eubanks checked his altimeter. 3,500 feet. That gave him barely 60 seconds of flight time before impact. He looked down. The ground below wasn't a nice, flat English meadow. It was the front line. It was a moonscape of shell craters, mud, and shattered trees. Tanks were moving through the fields. Artillery was firing. He had to put a delicate, high-performance fighter plane down in the middle of a battlefield without an engine, without hydraulics for the flaps, and with a windscreen covered in oil. He spotted a strip of dirt road running between 2 artillery batteries. It was narrow, cratered, and lined with telephone poles on both sides. It was a suicide landing, but it was the only option. He dipped the left wing, lining up the approach. He had one shot, no go-arounds. If he came in too high, he would crash into the trees at the end. If he came in too short, he would stall and spin into the mud. He pushed the nose down to keep his speed up. 150 miles per hour. 140. The telephone poles rushed up to meet him. He was committed. The final gamble had begun. The silence was the loudest sound Eubanks had ever heard. Without the roar of the Packard Merlin, the P-51 became a phantom. All he could hear was the whistling of the wind over the gun ports and the terrifying thump-thump of his own heart beating against his ribs. The telephone poles lining the dirt road weren't just obstacles anymore. They were sentinels waiting to swat him out of the air. He was coming in hot. 130 miles per hour. The manual said to land at 100, but without engine power to correct a stall, he had to keep the speed up until the very last second. If he flared too early, he would drop like a stone and break his back. If he flared too late, he would bounce and cartwheel into the artillery pits. He gripped the stick with both hands, his knuckles white. The ground rushed up. Mud, craters, spent shell casings. He saw the terrified faces of American GIs diving into foxholes as the silver monster silently screamed over their heads. He was 10 feet off the deck. 5 feet. He pulled the stick back into his gut. The Mustang floated for a split second, bleeding off energy. The stall warning buffeted the airframe. The wings wobbled. Then, gravity took over. Crunch. The main gear slammed into the German mud. It wasn't a smooth touchdown. It was a collision. The P-51 weighed 5 tons fully loaded, and it hit the earth with the violence of a freight train derailment. The landing gear struts compressed to their limits and screamed. The plane bounced once, slewed sideways, and slammed down again. Eubanks slammed his feet on the brake pedals, but the hydraulic pressure was fading fast. The brakes were spongy. The mud was the only thing slowing him down. The propeller, frozen in its vertical position, acted like a sail. The plane skidded wildly to the left, heading straight for a telephone pole. Eubanks kicked the right rudder, trying to steer, but the mud had claimed the wheels. He braced himself against the cockpit walls. This is it, he thought. The left wing clipped the pole. There was a sickening sound of tearing metal. The laminated wood of the pole shattered. The aluminum tip of the wing sheared off completely. The impact spun the Mustang around in a violent ground loop. The world outside the canopy became a kaleidoscope of brown earth and gray sky, spinning at dizzying speed. The tail wheel snapped. The fuselage slammed into the dirt, sliding sideways, digging a trench deep into the road. Dirt, rocks, and mud sprayed over the canopy, burying the glass. The screeching of metal on stone was deafening, a high-pitched shriek that pierced Eubanks's helmet. And then, as quickly as the violence had started, it stopped. The Mustang came to rest at a 45-degree angle, one wing buried in a ditch, the nose pointing at the sky. Steam hissed from the shattered engine cowling. The smell of raw fuel and hot glycol flooded the cockpit. Eubanks sat frozen for a moment, his hand still gripping the dead stick, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He checked his arms. He checked his legs. Everything was still attached. He fumbled for the canopy release handle. It was jammed. The frame had twisted in the crash. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. Fire. That was the pilot's nightmare. If the fuel tanks ruptured, he would be cooked alive in his aluminum coffin. He smashed his shoulder against the glass. He kicked at the frame. "Hey, get him out! Bring the crowbar!" A voice. American, rough, shouting, beautiful. Eubanks saw shadows moving outside the mud-covered glass. Hands were clawing at the canopy. A rifle butt smashed into the plexiglass, starring it. Then again, the canopy shattered. Strong hands grabbed his flight harness. He was hauled out of the cockpit, coughing, dragged across the wing, and dropped onto the cold, wet mud of the roadside. He looked up. A circle of dirty, unshaven faces was looking down at him. They wore olive drab. They held M1 Garins. They were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. The sergeant handed him a cigarette. Eubanks' hands were shaking so violently he couldn't hold the match. The GI lit it for him. The smoke filled his lungs, replacing the taste of oil and fear. For a long minute, nobody spoke. They just stood there in the mud, staring at the smoking wreckage of the P-51 Mustang. It lay on its belly like a slain dragon, wings shattered, propeller bent, leaking fluids into the German soil. "Sir," the sergeant finally whispered, looking at the bridge in the distance, then back at the plane. "Did you just fly under that?" Eubanks didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, exhaling a cloud of blue smoke. The infantrymen looked at each other in disbelief. They had seen dogfights. They had seen crashes. But they had never seen a man wrestle a 5-ton fighter plane onto a dirt road in the middle of an artillery barrage and walk away with nothing but a bruised shoulder. They took him to the command tent. They gave him hot coffee laced with whiskey. By nightfall, the story had already spread down the line. The infantry told the tankers. The tankers told the artillery crews. The story of the crazy Mustang pilot who killed a jet, dived at the speed of sound, and threaded the needle of the Rhine Bridge became a ghost story. Some said he was invincible. Others said he had a death wish. Back at Leiston Airfield, Eubanks was listed as missing in action. When he returned to base 3 days later, hitched on a supply truck, his commanding officer didn't court-martial him for destroying a $50,000 aircraft. He poured him a drink. Intelligence had confirmed the kill. The wreckage of a Me-262 had been found near the bomber track. Eubanks had traded a piston-engine fighter for one of Hitler's secret jets. In the grim accounting of war, that was a profitable trade. But the real victory wasn't the kill. It was the survival. Engineers later calculated the physics of his dive. They concluded that at 550 miles per hour, Eubanks had exceeded the structural limit of the P-51 airframe by 40%. The trim tab maneuver shouldn't have worked. The bridge clearance was less than 2 feet on each wingtip. Mathematically, James "Slick" Eubanks should have been dead 3 times over. He flew 20 more missions before the war ended. He survived them all, but he never pushed the red line again. He didn't have to. He had stared into the abyss of the sound barrier, fought the laws of aerodynamics, and won. Years later, when asked about that day over Berlin, Eubanks would just smile and look at his hands. The hands that had fixed tractors in Oklahoma, the hands that had tamed a runaway Mustang. He would say, "The manual tells you what the machine can do, but only the pilot knows what the machine will do." That dive wasn't just a maneuver. It was a testament to the human element in a war of machines. It proved that no matter how fast the jets flew, or how advanced the technology became, the most dangerous component in any cockpit was still the man with the instinct to survive. If you believe that pilots like James Eubanks deserve to be remembered, hit that like button. It helps us keep these stories alive. And if you want to hear more about the impossible feats of World War II that history books forgot, make sure you're subscribed. The sky is full of ghosts, and we have many more stories to tell.